Our last presenter today is Jon Axeline. I really wish I could take credit for the title for his piece, The Reverend Crisler and the Nine Commandments. God, it's wonderful stuff. John's a Montana native. That's important, I know. He got his MA at MSU in 1985 and then fought the Montana brain drain by staying here. Others said he could not put the money together to get to Denver. In the intervening years, he worked a number of cultural resource studies, which got him around to some fine high points in the state. One of which was Havre, which is where he ran into the Reverend Crisler. John's currently employed as a historian at the Montana Department of Highways. Some people would see a serious contradiction in terms there. Jon honestly is proving that that may not be the case.
Thank you. First off, I want to say is the events I'm about to tell you about occurred 68 years ago today. So it seems kind of appropriate that we're going to be talking about a jerk when the jerk ended up, well, anyway, I'll tell you about it. This whole project kind of started out as a Halloween, ghost story for the Havre Daily News. As like Dave was saying, I was employed up in Havre to do the Havre historic building survey. And as Lindell was kind of saying, you kind of run into these jerks. They kind of be like a knot in the wood. All of a sudden you'll be going along great, and then you'll hit something that's really more interesting than a house, and then go off on a tangent, which is exactly what happened here. See, as I was, one of the committee members from Havre told me a ghost story supposedly about a woman in white who flitted around the second story of this house on 3rd Avenue. When I did a little bit more supplemental research on it, I found out that my informant was a little bit was fanciful, but the story behind it was the ghost was essentially true. He told me that on October 27th, a woman had shot and killed the Episcopalian minister in Havre and then killed herself. So of course, instead of looking at the minister's house, I went ahead and went through all the newspapers about what happened that day. And it was indeed a lot more interesting. The murder-suicide occurred in a house in Havre in the Historic District on October 27, 1922. The Reverend Leonard J. Crisler was shot and killed by Margaret Carleton, the estranged wife of the Havre judge Frank Carleton. There was only one witness to the tragedy, which happened to be Anna Crisler, the wife of the Reverend Crisler. So everything that I had to go from there was all based on the eyewitness account of one woman who was obviously emotionally involved with this. I asked around about it, and of course a lot of the old-timers in Havre remembered Reverend Crisler with a lot of fondness, but they also remembered his death. And the main thing that came out about it from these people was the fact that he was having an affair with the woman that shot him, and that's how the whole thing came about. So I became more involved in the story. I, of course, looked through all the newspaper accounts. The Havre newspaper was pretty good about telling you what happened, but they weren't as good as the Great Falls Leader, the Butte Miner, or the Box Elder Daily Press. In fact, the Box Elder Valley Press was the best thing I could have found for this thing. And of course, the coroner's inquest is also really interesting because it told me that Anna Crisler, who was the only eyewitness, was also lying, and that some of the things that she said that happened had actually not occurred. But the main thing that came out through all this was the fact that, in spite of the fact that Leonard Crisler was quite well known not only in Montana but throughout the whole country, that no one ever really tried to find out what the motivation was behind his death and then why this woman had killed herself. But as I looked into the coroner's inquest, talked around with some more Havre old-timers, and then put some things that weren't said together, it all started to make a lot of sense. Leonard Crisler was born in 1876 in Auburn, New York. He graduated from Brown University in 1896 and came to Montana in 1907, where he was the rector for the Milk River Mission. This district of his encompassed everything north of the Missouri River, west of Glacier Park, and all the way to North Dakota. Apparently he got around this section pretty well because he was good friends with James J. Hill and his son Lewis Hill, and apparently lectured a lot in the East about the merits of homesteading in north central Montana. So he was actually on the payroll for two different people at one time. But the good thing about all this was that by 1918 he'd established churches in Malta, Guildford, and Glasgow, along with a number of other smaller homestead communities in Montana. About this time, he was discovered by Stewart Edward White, who was a popular novelist of grisly and melodramatic westerns. White was real prolific in his writing and wrote a bunch of news magazine articles about Reverend Crisler and called him the Bishop of all outdoors, because if you read these articles, it makes it sound like Reverend Crisler literally walked all over his diocese in north central Montana and just gave up the railroad completely. By 1920, he was involved as a lecturer on spiritual and social issues for the Chautauqua Bureau. I'm not sure exactly which one initially, but later on I found out who he was working for, and the fact that the woman who eventually killed him was also working for the same companies. In 1914, he married Anna Wadsworth. Anna Wadsworth was really kind of an important person. Her uncle was J.W. Wadsworth, who was a U.S. Senator from New York. And her father was a wealthy upstate New York industrialist. So she had a lot of political connections and apparently a lot of money. Margaret Carleton, on the other hand, was born in 1889 in Helena. She was a granddaughter of William Davenport, who was a pioneer sheepman in Montana, and of Joseph Sly, who was a physician in Anaconda. In 1909, she married Charles Lautz, who was a hardware store clerk in Helena. By 1912, however, they divorced based on the fact that when Charles got drunk, he tended to take it out on Margaret. In 1917, Margaret married Frank Carleton, who was a Helena attorney and was later appointed to the Havre District Court judge in 1919. In 1920, the couple moved to Havre, and this is allegedly when the affair between the two people began, according to my aged informants in Havre. But I've got to say, too, that evidence for this alleged love affair is also kind of ephemeral at best. Apparently everybody in Havre knew about it, but no one was really willing to do anything about it. Crisler was such a great orator in Havre, he'd pack the house at his church every Sunday, and it wasn't necessarily with Episcopalians. Apparently they were mostly women. And I figured, well, he must have been pretty good if he's going to convert a lot of people over to Episcopalianism. About 1921, Frank left Havre. He left his wife on the grounds that the machinations of Reverend Crisler and her devotion to him had caused their marriage to disintegrate. Apparently, Leonard Crisler believed that it was because that Frank wasn't such a good financial manager and owed too many people too much money. I don't quite hold with that belief of Crisler's, because Frank went down to L.A. right after that and apparently made a killing someplace because he was financially supporting his wife while she was still in Havre having an affair with Reverend Crisler. Eventually, though, by late 1921, Bishop Faber of the Archdiocese in Helena had learned enough about this affair from letters written to him from people in Havre that he thought it was about time he better investigate it. So he went up to Havre, but he was unable to find anybody that knew anything about this thing. He said that eventually, since he couldn't find anything about it, it was all a plot on the part of Crisler's enemies to smear his good name in Havre, and that it had absolutely nothing to do with Margaret Carleton. But he later admitted after Crisler was killed that he never really probed the allegations that he was having an affair with Margaret Carleton. Also in 1921, Reverend Crisler and Margaret Carleton began touring with the Midwest Lyceum Bureau, Chautauqua Company, throughout the Midwest. Apparently he was still lecturing about the wonders of Montana, and also he was still lecturing about how it was important to have a good spiritual upbringing. And I should kind of digress too here for a minute, because in 1911, Reverend Crisler served as a term in the House of Representatives for the state of Montana in Helena for the legislature. And he introduced 5 bills during his term there, One of them had to deal with the opening of a publicity bureau in Montana. Another had to do with having political candidates reveal where they were getting their contributions. The last two, though, I think were kind of interesting. One of them was a bill to prevent husbands from giving their wives over to a house of prostitution and then living off the earnings that she made while employed therein. Of course, that bill never got out of committee. The second bill did, and I don't know exactly what happened with this, but the second bill had to deal with the reformation of erring women and girls. And apparently it did make it into Senate, and it was enacted, but I'm not sure exactly what the law was that dealt with it. So that's something that'll leave to a future historian that may be interested in this. Apparently the affair was real, too. To get back to the story, my research assistant while I was in Havre was about 80 years old, and he remembered seeing Reverend Crisler, Margaret Carleton, and Anna Crisler walking down the street at 3rd Avenue. He said it was kind of weird for an 11-year-old to see these three people because it was Leonard Crisler and Margaret Carleton walking side by side with Anna trying to keep up the rear. So he says, I knew something was going on, and he says later on his mother told him it was true. And she quit going to the Episcopalian church even though she was Catholic. Well, these are the basic facts we have in this case. We do know something was going on. We do know Reverend Crisler was concerned about the morals of women, and we do know he was married. In June, though, things started to kind of heat up, and this is where we kind of have a problem because we do have to rely on what Anna Crisler has to tell us and on the kind of vague things that some of the other people in Havre reported at the coroner's inquest after the deaths. We do know that in June of 1922, Margaret was employed by the Midwest Lyceum Bureau again, and that she had an operation for something. At the inquest, her doctor, Carl Foss, performed an operation on Mrs. Carleton and removed certain conditions that she was troubled with, unquote. At the inquest, he declined to say what the certain conditions were, although he was asked about it. But he did say that the operation left Margaret in a state of high nervous anxiety, prone to depression and anxiety attacks. It's hard to say. So as a consequence, he prescribed her sleeping powders to help her relax. And this was the last anybody heard about it until she returned to Havre in late October. In late July or early August, Margaret left Havre for Chicago, where she was about to begin her job with the Chautauqua. She got the job partially on the recommendation of Reverend Crisler, who also applied for a job with the company and got a job and was working for them also. And sometime that summer, while she was in Chicago, Margaret received a letter from her husband Frank saying that he would grant her a divorce. He said, and I quote, "I know that you have no love for me, and why the pretense? We have been apart a year, and there is absolutely no chance for happiness for you as my wife." Margaret, in true divorcee spirit, sent the letter off to Leonard Crisler, who replied, quote, "I want you to clean the slate at Havre. Your stock is going up there. Keep it going. Your own standard for pluck, common sense, and honesty in Montana is going to be recognized and respected if time, health, and God's blessing only permits." He also went on to say that she better take care of Frank's financial affairs so she wouldn't be blamed for it later on. And he ended up arriving in Chicago about 4 days later, where the two spent the next couple of weeks together. So Margaret returned to Havre about October 23rd. Apparently her nervous condition had repeated itself, and she was worse than ever because Dr. Foss renewed her prescription for the sleeping powders and increased the dosage. For some reason I'm not sure of, she attempted to commit suicide on October 26th. She apparently was high-strung. She was upset about something. She may have come back to Havre to clean the slate with Mrs. Crisler and had failed in that attempt. Anyway, she took a overdose of the sleeping powders and slept for the next 30 hours. About 5:40 p.m. the next day, she awoke and was in a state of hysteria. And Reverend Crisler just happened to be there when she woke up, because an upstairs neighbor had come downstairs to see if she could help her and found Reverend Crisler down there soothing her. Shortly after the upstairs neighbor left, Crisler left the apartment where Mrs. Carlton was staying and went to the train depot to pick up Charles Chapman, who was a rector of the St. Paul's Episcopal Church of Butte. Apparently the two were going to hold a service that night. After the service was over, however, Margaret ended up, or excuse me, I'm going to backtrack a little bit here. As soon as the inquest, or as soon as the service was over, Anna Crisler suggested to Reverend Crisler and his friend Charles Chapman and a group of male friends that they might want to go downtown and get a late dinner. So, of course, the whole group left except for Anna Crisler, who decided for some reason that she needed to go home. She told the newspapers the next day that she went home to pick up a set of keys, but at the coroner's inquest 2 days later, she said she went down there for personal reasons, and it was nobody else's business but her own. When she arrived there, she found Margaret Carlton in her living room busily tearing up photographs of Leonard Crisler and burning them. I don't know how she did that without burning up the house, but apparently she was burning them on the floor. When Mrs. Crisler asked her what she was doing there, she said that Margaret had mumbled incoherently to her, and Anna said that she did not appear to be in her right mind. After a casual conversation for a few minutes, Margaret and Mrs. Crisler left, and apparently Margaret was going to join the group for dinner. When the group got together again up in uptown Havre, Margaret decided she didn't want to go with them and walked off. About an hour later, Margaret was seen about a half a block away from where she'd left the party, mumbling in an incoherent state with clumsy movements, and apparently didn't know exactly where she was. And Dr. Foss later said at the inquest that she did that because of the effects of the overdose that would have left her in an incoherent state for the next 8 to 10 hours. He said that she wouldn't know where she was, what she was doing, how she got there, or what she was saying, that her movements would be clumsy, and it was generally what he called a post-anesthetic state. Apparently the Crisler party finished their dinner about 1 o'clock a.m., and Mr. and Mrs. Crisler went on home. Margaret arrived there about 5 minutes after Leonard and Anna did. For some reason, they let her in the house, and if she was in such a state, that kind of surprises me. But she apparently carried on a normal conversation with Leonard and Anna for about 5 minutes, which apparently she dominated the conversation. At the end of that 5 minutes, she turned to Mrs. Crisler, and she says, "There is no room in your life for him," at which point Leonard Crisler got up to go to his room. Apparently, Anna Crisler got up to let Mrs. Carlton out, and just as she got to the door and turned her back, she heard 2 shots like snapping fingers, just like that, and she heard 2 bodies fall. She turned around, ran to the hall, found her husband wedged against the door inside of his room, so apparently Margaret had shot him just as he was closing the door. And then she found Margaret Carlton laying across the hall on her face with her hands sticking out from underneath her. So in true good fashion, it shows that Mrs. Crisler was really thinking about what she should do next. She called Bishop Faber and Helena and told him what happened. Then she called the 2 physicians who showed up about 15 minutes later. Then she called the police. But in the meantime, she'd also sent telegrams to everybody that was involved in this. It was really peculiar. 5 minutes after that, Margaret Carlton's mother, Elizabeth Pyle, called from Helena to find out what was going on up there. So it gets to be a little bit confusing from now on. When the doctors arrived, they brought their wives with them. They went to the hallway. They did say, well, Leonard Crisler is definitely dead. And they looked at Mrs. Carlton and said, well, she's dead too. And they took the gun out of her hand. So they were really tampering with evidence. The police showed up about 10 minutes later. They said they had gotten lost and they couldn't find the house, although 3rd Avenue is one of the main streets in Havre. And so they looked at the 2 bodies and said, yep, a murder-suicide. And that was supposedly the end of it. The 2 bodies were taken away, and Anna Crisler said that she would pay for the funerals of both people. Now I should tell you a little bit about Margaret's mother. Margaret's mother was Elizabeth Pyle. She was married to Joseph Pyle, who was an Anaconda Company executive. Because Elizabeth Pyle was related to the Davenports and Dr. Sly in Anaconda, she had a lot of political connections and a lot of political clout. Shortly after she heard about what had happened in Havre, she called Senator Thomas Walsh in Washington, and he agreed to represent her because she didn't believe that her daughter had done it. And apparently there was a general feeling in Havre, and enough pressure was put on the county coroner that he declared that there would be an inquest the next day against his best wishes. As soon as this all happened, somehow the newspapers got a hold of it, and newspapermen from New York, Seattle, Kansas City, and all over Montana descended on Havre, to which the county coroner said it was none of their damn business what had happened. The following day, Mrs. Crisler, who was obviously grief-stricken, stood in front of the congregation of her church and told everybody that she had seen the whole thing. That she saw Margaret shoot her husband, that she turned around, pointed the gun at her, pulled the trigger when it failed to fire. Margaret Carleton turned the gun on herself and killed herself. Then with her body falling across that of Leonard Crisler's. At the map that was provided in the coroner's inquest, they were located at opposite ends of the hall, and there was no possible way they could have fallen across each other, which is compounded by the fact that when Leonard fell, he wedged himself against the door and they couldn't even get the door open. So Anna was a little bit confused about what had happened, and she didn't really seem to know. For someone who was in the room, she didn't really seem to know anything that had happened, which I found was a little unusual too. She also didn't seem to think that there was anything going on between her husband and Mrs. Carleton, even though everybody else in Havre knew. I guess it's true that the wife was the last one to know. At the coroner's inquest, a lot of real interesting facts came out. Usually at inquests, there will be some question about the motivation behind the crime, but there wasn't any question about that at this inquest. It seemed as if everybody on the board knew that there was something going on between these two people, and that was probably the reason for the suicide. As it got a little bit weirder, though, from there on, because apparently one of the jury foreman didn't believe that Margaret Carleton had killed Leonard Crisler, and instead believed that Anna Crisler had killed both of them. And so his questions were real leading and real pointed. He would ask the chief of police whether a woman of her size and condition could have used the gun to shoot herself so accurately, considering it was a .38 caliber pistol, to shoot herself right through the heart, and of course shoot Reverend Crisler through the heart also from across the hall, in a condition where she wasn't really functioning totally, that she was in that clumsy post-anesthetic state that Foss was talking about. Foss also reiterated again that she was highly nervous and a sick woman, and she wasn't responsible for what she was doing. My question that came up when I was reading the inquest is that if the events happened as fast as Anna Crisler said they happened, how could a woman in the condition that Margaret Carleton was in move across the room, missing all the furniture, and shoot herself and Leonard Crisler with the degree of accuracy that she did? And that was something that wasn't really touched on. What was touched on by Mrs. Pyle, Margaret's mother, was the fact that the gun that she had used to kill Leonard Crisler wasn't her gun. Apparently she packed a .22 caliber revolver, and that was found back in her hotel room. So she said that wasn't her gun, and consequently she didn't do it. She also said that when they found the body, that it was missing all the rings on the right hand, and she said that when Margaret was seen earlier in the evening that the rings were still there. So of course she believed that someone had removed the rings that placed the pistol in her hand, but that's something we won't know because Dr. McKenzie took it out of her hand and really messed everything up for whatever happened, for whoever did it. So the basic thing, I guess, it came down to the fact is that I don't think Margaret Carleton did it. I think Mrs. Crisler did it because she knew about the relationship, regardless of what she said. And apparently that was pretty widely held because the newspapers that came out after the inquest really started hitting around that, yes, there was something going on between these people. And I don't know how much of that had to do with the fact that newspapers in the 1920s tended to be more like the National Enquirer than they are now. But the mere fact that this simple murder-suicide, as Coroner Holland called it, generated such massive coverage all across the country tended to make you believe that maybe something else had happened than what they had actually told you. I've had some other historians look at this, and they agree that maybe there was some kind of a cover-up in Havre to protect the reputations of the people involved, except for Mrs. Carleton. Eventually, though, Frank Carleton wrote to the newspapers, and he was a little incensed by Bishop Faber's statement that I'll quote this, it says, this is Bishop Faber, I believe as a result of the investigation I have made of the tragedy which occurred at the Crisler home early Friday morning, and after questioning those who knew about it, that if this woman had been able to work her will on Mr. Crisler, he would still be alive today, unfaithful to his wife, but still alive. Frank Carleton, who apparently carried a torch for his wife all this time, if he was willing to support her and wait so long before filing for a divorce, replied that this attempt to make it appear to the world that Margaret threw herself upon this man and that he tried to remonstrate and lead her into a spiritual path has goaded me into expression. The so-called investigation alluded to must of necessity have consisted of taking a few statements from the close friends and protectors of the pastor, for any delving into the facts and circumstances surrounding the matter would have so conclusively shown the true part that Crisler played in the escape from his condemnation would have been impossible. And that statement is pretty much true, because the only people they really questioned about this were Crisler's friends and people who were involved with him on a financial basis. He further went on to say, I protest this attempt to condone the sins of the pastor. Pray tell me it was necessary for him to seek her out in Chicago and elsewhere. I too have known of Margaret's love for this man for several years, and it is only fair to say that she confessed it to me. I will not further violate her confidence, but I do want to state unqualifiedly and unreservedly that it is a fact that this preacher had led her to believe that he returned that love. I want to further say that I had plenty of opportunity and occasion to observe and study this big man mentally and physically. Time and time again, I warned my wife and told her the results of my observations and pleaded with her to save herself before it was too late. I want to say to the world that Margaret is not to be blamed for this affair, but that the real blame should justly be placed upon the man who paid the price that must be paid by all who prove unfaithful to their trust. It's a pretty strong statement, and of course it wasn't printed in the Havre Daily News, it showed up in the Box Elder Valley Press. Eventually it was found that the revolver that was used in the shooting, in fact, did not belong to Margaret Carleton, but was used in a crime that had occurred about 3 years later. The police, however, were never able to determine where the weapon came from. And shortly after that, everything that was about this thing that had been covering the newspapers just kind of disappeared. Another photograph appeared about 3 days later showing a bereaved Anna Crisler going east with the body of her husband to be buried in Auburn, New York. She didn't stay away from Havre, however, because apparently she returned to Havre every summer to take care of the flowers at the church that her husband had built. But apparently there was still some undercurrent of discontent in Havre, because shortly after the death of Reverend Crisler, the cabin that he had built by hand south of town mysteriously burned to the ground. And when you go down there today, you can still see the large rock chimneys sticking out in the middle of this big empty field. Local rumors, of course, which were rampant at that time all over the state, said that a jilted lover or perhaps an angry husband had torched the place. While the tragedy sparked sensational headlines for a time, it is now virtually forgotten. Everybody in Havre just remembers the good things about Reverend Crisler and doesn't remember any of the unflattering things that came out about his relationship between his wife and Margaret Carleton in 1922. Perhaps this is good, because, as you know, a religious man, a lot of people put a lot of faith in a religious man, and they don't want to see anything come out that might jeopardize their good opinion of him. But I guess it does show that Reverend Crisler was human, that he apparently used his good looks and his charm and his great speaking abilities to his own ends with women. That he also used it to advance the economic and social development in north central Montana. I wish in a way that the ghost story was true, because it might really add a nice postscript to this story. But I did find in Havre that the rumors are still quite strong that he was involved with this woman. And I recently paid a visit to the grave of Margaret Carleton in Helena, for which her mother paid for, and not Anna Crisler, because apparently Mrs. Pyle thought that Mrs. Crisler had shot her daughter and blamed it on her. And apparently her daughter, Margaret Carlton's daughter by her previous marriage, is still around because flowers have appeared on the grave on Memorial Day. So I think this would be a real interesting woman to find out or talk to, because I'm sure she'd have a different perspective of what happened in Havre in 1922.
Thank you. Our second presenter is Ellen Sievert, who'll talk on James Fergus. Ellen comes to Montana history via circuitous route. She's a professional design major from MSU, but more and more frequently got interested in architecture and then preservation. And it's only a half step then from architectural history into social and cultural. If you run into a three-panel door with a single oval light and an articulated door surround, it does lead you to ask, who'd do such a thing? She's an advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation on the State Preservation Review Board, Montana Preservation Alliance Executive Board, and a member of the Montana Culture and Aesthetic Committee. More important than these duties and honors, she's a Lewistown native and was Lewistown Preservation Officer for a number of years there. So she's not an outsider going after a poor, dead Montanan.
The year is 1855, central Minnesota territory. You walk through the O.A. Churchill and Company General Store. Your eyes are drawn to a headline peeking out from a rack near the register. James Fergus charged with mismanagement and poor business practices. Partner asks, is Fergus an honest man? As is your usual practice, you peruse the headlines, make your purchase, and leave without delving into the journal for an answer. James Fergus could have and did generate many headlines throughout his life. An infidel with high morals, a Republican with very liberal ideas, a legislator but not a politician, a frontier businessman, husband, father, miner, rancher, and free thinker. His is the story of an unusual pioneer. In many ways, he did reflect the temper of the age, but James Fergus contrasts sharply with the accepted image of a 19th century frontier American. As a native of Fergus County, my knowledge of the county's patriarch has been limited to a few headlines. So it was with some relish that I opened the journals on James Fergus, beginning with, young James Fergus flogged by father for questioning Presbyterian doctrines. Born in Scotland in 1813, James was blessed with an inquiring mind. Both he and his rigid Presbyterian father were strong-minded and unbending, setting the stage for a dim future for the lad through mistreatment and disinheritance. So James made his way to North America, learned the trade of a millwright, and began to make his fortune. Fergus embraced infidelity, as he called it, by the mid-1840s while he was managing his foundry in Moline, Illinois. Thus began a lifetime of blistering attacks on organized religion. "The hell that frightened us in our childhood has vanished into space," he said. "Heaven is not in our geographies." He seldom avoided confrontation if it would advance this liberal cause. During a later legislative session, Fergus countered a motion to hire a chaplain with an offer to read a few lines from Shakespeare each morning. To Fergus, a combination of reason, common sense, and science would lead man out of his deplorable condition and blind faith in idols. If that was not enough, he also recommended regulating matrimony and, quote, cutting out all consumptives and mentally weak and all that sort of thing, and save the people the heavy expense of infirmaries, insane asylums, and similar state institutions. It would be better for the race, too. We would have taller and abler men and more beautiful women. If this could not be accomplished by law, I would take more heroic measures to regulate matrimony. Confirmed bachelor Fergus says he has a squaw out west. This headline, unfortunately, remained a one-liner. Far too busy working, studying, and saving money, he had no time to court and avoided social activities until he met a charming young woman of Scotch descent during the 1844 Christmas season. Pamelia Dillon charmed James Fergus at once, and they were married just 3 months after their first meeting. Typical of the hardworking James, there was no honeymoon. The next morning found him busy in his foundry. Within 5 years, 3 children were born to the union, giving the ambitious Scot even more responsibility. He doubled his normally strenuous efforts and immersed himself in the foundry. While his wife complained that he was not giving attention to his home and family, his business prospered. But his health began to deteriorate due to the excessive workload. He suffered with indigestion and nervous complaints that threatened him with a softening of the brain. His failing health led Fergus to sell his interest in the business after 8 years and cast about for new business potential. The search took him on a 6-week tour of eastern cities in 1853. James wrote home with eloquent descriptions of the fine life he was leading in New York and Washington, D.C., and Chicago and New Haven and so on. He said, "I wish you were all here with me. You could see enough of the world to enlarge your ideas and views of things." At home in Moline, surrounded by chicken pox and 3 children aged 2, 4, and 6, Pamelia had little hope of enlarging her ideas. Unable to find a business or location that attracted him, James returned to Moline and began to listen to the beckoning of distant frontiers. The Fergus family then moved upriver to sparsely settled Minnesota territory. What really happened at Little Falls? James Fergus entered into a partnership with William Sturgis and Calvin Tuttle for the purpose of developing the town of Little Falls, Minnesota, and associated enterprises. This effort at town speculation ultimately failed due to a combination of problems, including the National Depression, droughts, floods, and probably some ill-advised business decisions. The partners' meetings disintegrated into name-calling sessions, and Fergus was charged with mismanagement by a disgruntled partner. He, however, stubbornly refused to open the company books to his partners. There could have been some truth to the accusations, for while Fergus publicly claimed to have been financially destroyed by the disasters, he had prudently transferred much of his property to Pamelia's name when the businesses began to fail. In March 1860, Fergus patched things up as best he could with the Little Falls Manufacturing Company and immersed himself in a new partnership, the Pikes Peak Company of Little Falls. Yielding to the temptation of easy riches, the 4 partners prepared to cross the plains. His decision to leave his family and start for the gold mines of the Rocky Mountains was casually introduced to a rather surprised Pamelia. But James left detailed instructions on everything from what and when to plant, what animals to fatten, and slaughter and sell, to company business matters and child care. He gave Pamelia the power of attorney over his property and remaining company shares so that she could act in his behalf. His prime concerns were for her to stall creditors, keep the books away from Tuttle, and try not to lose any more of their property. In addition, she was to keep taking and forwarding the New York Times, the St. Paul Press, and the Boston Investigator. In the 18 months James was away, she managed to save the land and livestock that they needed to survive. James, however, got poorer the longer he stayed in Mind. He returned home to Little Falls, but only for a few months until the lure of mountain gold again drew him across the plains, this time to the northern Rockies. He again left his family on the Minnesota frontier, soon to be inflamed by a Sioux uprising, self-righteously providing his overburdened wife with yet another set of survival instructions. He didn't see them again for 2 years. With a newly purchased bull team, he joined the Fisk expedition and ultimately lighted in the Grasshopper Creek area, later known as Bannock. His industry and frugality provided the resources to once again unite the Fergus family, this time in Montana Territory. As the family settled in together, James noted that there were major adjustments to be made. After pulling in separate harness for so long, they found themselves unevenly yoked. Pamelia had been put in a leadership role, and it was very difficult for her to again become the obedient wife. When James predicted that his going away would be a great benefit by throwing his family on their own resources and forcing Pamelia to do business for herself, he did not realize what all that learning would do for their relationship. Following a dinner at which James had publicly upbraided Pamelia for over-salting the food, she defended herself in front of the family and guests. James expressed his displeasure in a letter, as he was wont to do. Quote, "Mrs. Fergus, I have not had an opportunity to give you my private opinion of the disgraceful scene that took place before Mr. Gilpatrick, Thomas Dillon, and your own family at dinner one day last week, in which you made use of such language as never fails to disgrace or at least lower a female in the estimation of all respectable people. Profane language is allowable to men by common custom, but when used by a woman is generally allowed that she has only to add drinking. and then is prepared to become a public woman. They are the only women whom everybody expects to hear swear, and even some of them have never stooped so low." Fergus continued with an anti-salt diatribe and continued with myriad complaints regarding Pamelia's conduct, and drew his bill of complaints to a close with, "I wish you would do a little thinking and find that you have some duties to perform. When I talk to you, you either remain silent, which is a disrespect that no thinking person would ever offer, or make use of language that you know is untrue, or swear and use abusive language. You ought to be thankful that you are situated as you are and treated as you are. I would say more, but language cannot convey my contempt of such conduct and scenes as the one I first found fault with. I am certain I would never come near such a person if circumstances did not compel me. I would let you find some lower element in which to practice your contrary nature and your profanity." It was a difficult time. James soon became restless, and while still making good money from his claims in the Bannock, Virginia City area, he decided to move to the Prickly Pear drainage, where he had already staked a few claims. Pamelia once again packed her goods and moved to the homestead on Last Chance Gulch. Gold proved elusive, and the family drifted into managing a stage station, some small-scale ranching, and raising produce. In 1880, James, now 67 years old, prepared for one last move to Marr County in central Montana Territory. He had made and lost considerable money in business, town speculation, and mining, yet he approached their future in ranching on the plains with great optimism. A legislator, not a politician, Fergus first took a prominent place in the conduct of public affairs in Montana while mining at Bannock. A member of the miners' court, he was appointed its first judge and won honor by his rulings and decisions. Later, he was the first recorder of Alder Gulch and was a county commissioner for Madison County. He was soon recognized as a man of action, a person who held interest in and gave thought to community affairs, and who did not hesitate to speak or pen his thoughts. After his move to the Helena area, he served 2 terms as Lewis and Clark County Commissioner and 1 term in the House of Representatives. James often worked in the center of controversy. He soon achieved a reputation as an outspoken advocate of accountability and reduced public spending, one who did not hesitate to stand for what he believed. James Fergus was elected to serve from Marr County when the territory issued a call for a constitutional convention in 1884. One of the most explosive issues before the convention dealt with mining taxation. Fergus opposed a tax break for mining unless all state business and industry received similar consideration. Attacked by the pro-mining press in Butte, James, never one to retreat from a confrontation, quickly responded in the Butte Miner. He considered a tax break for mining property to be unconstitutional. The argument that mining capital would avoid the state without special consideration swayed him not at all, and he said, "All right, let foreign capital stay away. Your mines will be worked out soon enough. Look at poor Nevada, where is the great Comstock worked out, and the Mackays and Floods are spending the proceeds in Europe. Our minerals are as much the wealth of this country as the grass or the timber, and why should we allow foreign corporations to carry off much of this wealth and not tax them on their investments the same as on any other property? Butte will be a second Virginia city, worked out the bulk of its wealth in Europe, and these foreign corporations must be petted, favored, and pay less than other industries while they are carrying off our wealth, our capital that can never be replaced." When the delegates considered a preamble and a Bill of Rights, the committee report included a devout passage. "We, therefore, the people of Montana, acknowledging with grateful hearts the goodness of the great legislator of the universe." This immediately aroused the ire of the agnostic Fergus, who responded with a carefully written speech justifying the exclusion of God from the Montana Constitution. While he stood almost alone on the delicate issue, the speech did mark Fergus as one of the most well-read delegates in attendance, contrary to the image held of most ranchers. Of course, James was again attacked in the papers for his stand on the religious issues. He noted with disgust that most delegates went, had a lovely time, oiled by free whiskey and champagne, and much of the conversation sounded like yells of a band of drunken Indians than a party of Christian constitution makers. Though criticized for his opposition to the mining tax break and his unorthodox stand on religion, he did not lack for editorial support. Most agreed that our venerable delegate had every right to express his opinions and was too well equipped for the average politician to tackle. Similar issues would surface again the next year when Fergus received the Republican nomination for the 1885 Territorial Council. He was jolted to learn that he would oppose his good friend and fellow rancher Granville Stewart. The outcome of the Stewart-Fergus race was unpredictable, offered a Republican friend. In short, it will be nip and tuck. You are both old-timers, both old infidels, and neither cares a damn what he says. Neither man campaigned actively because of their friendship. However, most people knew James' views on most questions, and he won by 127 votes. James believed that a good legislator usually voted no and introduced few bills. Therefore, he introduced only 2 pieces of legislation, one to divide Marr County and a series to reduce public salaries. Fergus did arouse considerable mirth when, after reading the minutes of a previous day, he moved to amend, striking out the words "prayer by chaplain" and inserting "political appeal to the Lord." James thought the chaplain had made a remarkable prayer, during which he saw fit, in addition to much political news, to inform the deity that 100,000 men were trembling in their shoes for fear of losing their offices, and 100,000 others waiting anxiously to take their place. The Fergus motion lost by 1 vote. Fergus returned from the 1885 Territorial Council the patriarch of a new county named in his honor. In the fall of 1887, Familia Fergus passed away. The decade of the 90s found James a respected observer of the political scene, though his biting pen continued to prod both politicians and public on many issues. He rarely left the ranch, but continued a relatively active life until his death in 1902. James Fergus read an average of 3 hours a day for at least 40 years of his life. He surrounded himself with a private library of some 2,500 volumes in a dizzying array of subjects. He subscribed to some 40 periodicals. He had a quick mind and a sharp tongue, and he was a little radical in some of his views. There are still many unanswered questions, headlines that we haven't even touched on. One of my favorites was relayed by my grandfather, who arrived in central Montana about 1883. He said that it was common knowledge that James Fergus's hair turned white overnight when he discovered that they had hanged the wrong man. This is a subject we didn't even touch on and don't have time to. But when I opened the journals on James Fergus, I just knew there had to be a jerk in there someplace. And I came away concluding that jerks must be in the eye of the beholder, as witnessed by these words which appeared in the New Northwest. Mr. Fergus is a thoroughly honest man, the noblest work of God in every sense of the word. His character is as sturdy as the mountains of his chosen home, and his life as pure as the snow that tips their summits. All hail James Fergus. Now, I invite you to look into this man.
Certainly the term jerk is ambiguous enough to include an iconoclast.